Hello, ladies and gentlemen. The self you think of as you is a construct, an idea that the mind has created and clings to. When you look at yourself in the mirror or reflect on your life, what you see is a collection of images, memories, and sensations that you have identified as I. But if you trace these elements, you will find that none of them are truly permanent. Your thoughts are fleeting, your memories distorted and ever-changing, and your physical body is in a constant state of flux. There is no solid, unchanging entity beneath these experiences. What we call the self is just a bundle of processes, a brief moment in an endless flow of existence. Consider the way waves form on the surface of the ocean. They seem distinct from one another, rising and falling in a rhythmic dance. But if you look closely, you will see that each wave is made of water, and the water is always the same, endlessly moving. Waves appear to be separate, but in truth they are nothing other than the ocean expressing itself in that moment. The wave has no separate existence, it is part of the larger whole, and when it crashes, it merges back into the ocean. In the same way, the self you identify with is no more separate than a wave on the sea. It arises, it experiences, and it returns to the flow of the universe. Our perception of the self as something distinct and fixed comes from the way the mind works. The mind has a tendency to create distinctions, to draw lines between things, to say, this is me, and that is not me. This is the essence of the ego and artificial division that we hold on to, believing that it represents our true identity. But if you examine this ego closely, you will find that it's always changing, always responding to new information, new experiences. What you consider yourself today may not even resemble the self you had a few years ago, and yet you continue to cling to this idea of continuity. This is because the ego thrives on the illusion of permanence, despite the fact that everything, thoughts, emotions, and even physical form is constantly in motion. If we take a step back, we can see that the self is not a solid, unchanging entity, but a fleeting appearance in the mind's eye. It is a pattern, a transient configuration of thoughts, memories, and sensations, like a passing storm. We may experience moments of deep connection or flow, where the sense of self disappears altogether when we are absorbed in a task, in a relationship, or in the beauty of nature. In these moments, there is no longer an I, watching the world, only the world unfolding. And in that moment, the illusion of separation evaporates. The idea of I becomes irrelevant. All that remains is the experience itself, uninterrupted by the need for an observer. The idea of the self that we hold on to so tightly is like a mask we wear throughout our lives, never questioning it, never seeing that it is simply a role we play in the vast drama of existence. We are so caught up in identifying with the mask, the ego, that we forget the face behind it. But once the mask is removed, we see the truth. We are not the mask. We are the expression of the universe in this moment. Just as a wave is not separate from the ocean, neither are we separate from the infinite flow of life. The moment we realize this, the need to protect and defend our separate identity fades away, and we begin to see the interconnectedness of all things. From the moment we are born, society begins shaping us, subtly guiding our understanding of who we are and how we relate to others. We are taught to think of ourselves as separate individual entities, distinct from everyone and everything around us. This conditioning starts early through language, family dynamics, education, and the roles we are encouraged to play. We are told that we are individual achievers separate from the collective, and that our worth is measured by how well we fit into these predefined roles. Over time, this concept of a distinct, isolated self takes root, and we come to believe that it is the truth of who we are. But if we take a moment to step outside of the narrative, to observe without judgment, we begin to see the construction of this so-called self. It is a patchwork quilt of ideas, beliefs, habits, and expectations that have been draped over us by society. We carry these roles like costumes, wearing them so convincingly that we begin to believe they are our true identity. We might identify ourselves as a student, a worker, a parent, or any number of labels that define our relationship to the world. But these are not our essence. They are merely social constructs, fleeting roles in an ever-shifting play. This social construct of the ego is not inherently bad or wrong. It serves a purpose. It helps us navigate the world, interact with others, and function within society. But the danger arises when we confuse the roles we play with who we truly are. The more we attach ourselves to these labels, the more we lose sight of the underlying reality that we are part of a greater interconnected whole. Just as an actor on a stage might lose themselves in the character they portray, we can easily forget that we are more than the roles society tells us to embody. Beneath the surface of these roles lies the same flow of life that connects us all. When we stop to observe the flow of life, we realize that the self we think of as isolated and separate is simply a construct, a temporary manifestation of the universe's ongoing dance. The boundaries we draw between me and you, us and them, are just that, boundaries. They are not real in any fundamental sense. Life is a constant ebb and flow, a dynamic process where everything is interconnected, changing and influencing one another. The idea of a permanent, isolated self becomes increasingly difficult to sustain when we truly see that we are part of an ever-moving river of life. The key, then, is not to reject these roles or labels entirely, but to see them for what they are: temporary expressions in the grander symphony of existence. When we step back and observe, we realize that the essence of who we are is not defined by the roles we play, but by the deeper connection we share with all things. The self that society teaches us to identify with is like a mask we wear in the social theater of life. But beneath that mask, beneath the construct of the ego, there is only the unbroken flow of life, ever changing, ever interconnected, and ever present. Identity, when we truly look at it, is more like a dance than a solid, unchanging entity. It moves, it shifts, it flows with the rhythm of life, and each moment it changes. The self is not something fixed, but a continuous unfolding of experience and energy. We might imagine ourselves as a stable eye, but in truth, this eye is more like a fleeting gesture and ever-changing movement in the great dance of existence. The more we try to hold on to this idea of a permanent identity, the more we struggle, like trying to grasp at the wind. We become trapped in the illusion of a solid self, and in doing so, we miss the deeper flow of life. When we cling to a rigid sense of who we are, we become disconnected from the flow of the present moment. We define ourselves by our past actions, memories, and labels, and we fight against the natural rhythms of change. But identity, like the dance, is not about holding still. It is about moving with grace, letting go of the need to define ourselves in a fixed way. Every step in the dance is unique, never to be repeated exactly the same. And yet it is always part of the larger, continuous movement. In the same way, the self is an ever-evolving expression of life. It emerges, it flows, and it returns to the whole. We often create suffering for ourselves by grasping at the past, holding on to old versions of ourselves, or worrying about future identities we may or may not become. But identity is not something that can be pinned down. It is like a dancer, moving fluidly from one form to the next, without clinging to any particular step. When we stop trying to capture it, when we stop trying to freeze it in time, we find that it becomes a natural part of the flow of life. It is in the letting go that we discover freedom, in the willingness to move with the music of the universe, instead of holding on to a rigid sense of who we think we should be. The secret of the dance of identity lies in surrendering to the movement, in being present to the moment without the need for definition. Just as a dancer flows with the rhythm of the music, we can allow ourselves to flow with the rhythms of life. This does not mean abandoning who we are, but rather recognizing that who we are is always in motion, always responding to the pulse of existence. The more we let go of the need for a fixed identity, the more we are able to experience the world without the limitations of self-imposed boundaries. Identity is not something we control or define, but something we participate in. It is a dance, a collaboration between our inner experience and the external world. When we learn to move with it, to let go of the need for certainty, we can experience the beauty and freedom of a life that is not bound by static ideas of who we are, but is free to flow, change, and become whatever it needs to be in the next moment. The dance is not something to fear, but something to embrace, for it is in the fluidity of identity that we truly discover the joy of being alive. The ego often positions itself as the observer, the one who stands apart from the world, watching as life unfolds. It sees itself as separate from the flow of existence, perched on the sidelines, as if it can objectively witness the drama of life without becoming part of it. This idea of the ego as a detached observer is compelling, but it is, in fact, an illusion. The very act of observing is itself part of the dance. The observer is not some independent entity that stands outside of experience. It is intricately woven into the fabric of the experience itself. The eye cannot see itself directly, just as the ego cannot truly observe itself without becoming part of what it observes. The division the ego creates between the subject and the object, between the self and the world, is a false one. We often think of the self as the subject, the one who is experiencing, and the world as the object, something to be observed. But if we dig deeper, we realize that this distinction is only in the mind. In truth, there is no separation. The observer and the observed are not two different things. They are simply aspects of the same flow of consciousness. When you truly experience something, you are not separate from it, you are it. The mind creates this illusion of separation, but in reality, the observer is just as much a part of the world as the observed. To realize this is to step into a state of pure awareness, where the boundaries of self dissolve, and there is no longer a distinction between the experiencer and the experience. In this state, there is no you observing the world from a distance. Instead, you become the world. The thought is no longer something you think, but something that arises within you. The ego, in its role as the observer, creates the illusion that there is a divide, but in the pure moment of awareness, there is only the unfolding of life as it is, without the need for division or separation. The ego, in trying to observe, misses the point. It is not outside the world, it is the world. When we step beyond this illusion of the ego as the detached observer, we enter a realm where everything is interconnected. The self, as we know it, dissolves into the greater flow of existence. The I who watches, who judges, who analyzes, becomes one with the things it perceives. The separation between the subject and the object vanishes. We are both the thinker and the thought, both the observer and the observed, playing our parts in the unfolding drama of life. To experience this directly is to experience the unity of all things, the realization that the world is not something we are separate from, but something we are continuously co-creating moment by moment. In this state of pure awareness, the ego's role as the observer is no longer needed. It is as if the ego takes a step back, allowing the flow of life to reveal itself without the interference of judgment or separation. There is no need for an I to be apart from the world, for we are never truly separate from it. The observer is not a fixed entity, it is part of the larger process of experience, ever-changing and interconnected with everything around it. When we see this, we transcend the limitations of the ego and embrace the reality that we are both the observer and the observed, the thinker and the thought, always moving in harmony with the unfolding of existence. When we step beyond the ego, we begin to experience a profound sense of unity with everything around us. This is not something we arrive at through intellectual understanding or through effortful thinking, but through a direct experiential realization. It's a moment of deep, undeniable awareness, where the illusion of separation falls away, and we recognize that we are not isolated entities, but part of the greater whole. This experience cannot be fully captured by words or concepts, because it transcends the realm of thought and enters the domain of direct experience, something felt rather than thought. In this state, we are not thinking about oneness, we are living it. This experience, which some may call enlightenment, is not a grand achievement or a distant goal to strive for, but rather the recognition that the boundaries we have constructed around ourselves through the ego, through identity, are merely projections of the mind. These boundaries, these walls we've erected to keep ourselves apart from others in the world, begin to crumble in the presence of this realization. The walls that once seemed so solid and real begin to appear as nothing more than fleeting shadows, illusions created by the mind's need to categorize and define. As we let go of the ego, we no longer see ourselves as separate from the world, but as a continuous flow interconnected with everything that is. In that moment, we dissolve into the world, and the world dissolves into us. There is no longer any distinction between where we end and where the world begins. We no longer see ourselves as a singular I standing apart from nature, from others, or from the universe. We are the tree, the wind, the stars, the breath that fills the air. It is as if the very fabric of existence enfolds us and we are part of its rhythm, its pulse. There is no self to defend, no ego to maintain, for in this state the need to protect and assert an individual identity simply disappears. There is only the vast, ever-present now, unfolding without resistance. This sense of oneness is not something we can seek or grasp, it is something we must allow ourselves to fall into. It is the realization that the ego, with all its desires and fears, is not the core of who we are. It is a temporary construct, a role we play in the drama of life. But the essence of who we are is not bound by that role, not limited by the constraints of the ego. When we step beyond this, we become aware of the infinite space that is always present, the space in which everything arises and falls away. In this space, there is no you and me, only the unfolding of life, ever-changing and ever-present. To transcend the ego is to stop fighting against the flow of existence, to stop defending a separate identity that never truly existed in the first place. It is to surrender to the realization that we are the flow, not the dam trying to hold it back. This is not something we can force or achieve through willpower. It is something we discover when we cease the struggle to hold on to the self. In that moment, we become one with everything, and everything becomes one with us. The boundaries that once defined us vanish, and we are left with only the pure experience of being, free from the illusion of separation. And lastly, the journey through the illusion of the separate self reveals the profound truth that the ego, as we understand it, is merely a fleeting construct of the mind. It is not a permanent, solid entity, but a temporary collection of thoughts, memories, and roles shaped by social conditioning. The more we identify with this illusory self, the more we are trapped in the cycle of suffering and separation. By seeing through the illusion, we recognize that what we call the self is nothing more than a transient dance of energy and experience, constantly flowing and changing with the rhythms of life. As we begin to observe the ego not as an isolated entity, but as part of the larger interconnected whole, we start to loosen our attachment to the roles we have been conditioned to play. We come to see that the identities we cling to are social constructs, masks that we wear in the great play of existence. When we realize this, we no longer need to defend or protect these roles, for we understand that they do not define us. Beneath them lies the ever-present flow of life in which all things are connected, and we are not separate from the world around us. The ego, in its attempt to stand outside and observe, creates a false division between subject and object. But in truth, we are both the observer and the observed. The separation we feel between ourselves and the world is an illusion of the mind, and the moment we see through this division, we enter a state of pure awareness. In this state, the boundaries between self and other dissolve, and we experience the interconnectedness of all things. The world is not something we are separate from, but a reflection of the same energy and consciousness that resides within us. Transcending the ego is not an intellectual pursuit or a distant goal to strive for, but a direct, lived experience of oneness. It is the realization that the boundaries we have drawn around ourselves are not real, and that in the moment we let go of the need to protect or assert an isolated identity, we dissolve into the flow of existence. In this profound moment, there is no self to defend, only the vast ever-present now. The world and the self are no longer two separate things, they are one, continuously unfolding together in an eternal dance. The experience of oneness is not something we achieve through effort or struggle, but something we uncover when we cease trying to hold on to the illusion of the ego. When we surrender to the flow of life, we step into a space where the boundaries between me and you, us and them, no longer exist. We become free from the need to defend our separate identities and are able to embrace the unity of all things. In this freedom, we find peace, for we realize that we have never been separate from the world, but always part of its continuous interconnected flow. Thanks for watching.